I came home to find my son unconscious in the basement. My wife was calmly reading a book. He disobeyed me. Consequences are a part of my business, she said. When the doctor I called arrived, he grabbed my arm, his voice trembling. Sir, you need to call the cops before your wife. The perfect facade. Alexander Beck straightened his tie as he entered the marble lobby of Meridian Capital, the investment firm he'd built from scratch over the last 15 years. At 43, he was a force in boardrooms from Manhattan to Los Angeles. His reputation for orchestrating complex mergers preceded him. Most people didn't know his skill in corporate warfare came from an earlier education. 8 years in Army intelligence had taught him to read people, anticipate their moves, and strike when they least expected it. The Hartley-Davidson merger had taken 3 months to finalize, requiring delicate negotiations between two pharmaceutical giants whose hatred ran deeper than their desire for profit. Alexander had spent the last 72 hours in Chicago managing egos and maneuvering around obstacles that would have destroyed lesser dealmakers. Now, it was done. $4 billion in combined assets, 2,000 jobs saved, and a commission that would secure his family's future for generations. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife, Victoria. Working late again. Don't wait up. V. Alexander frowned at the message's coldness. Victoria Tate Beck had always been direct, but lately her messages felt clinical. They'd been married for 12 years, and he could chart the slow erosion of warmth in her texts, like a stock's decline. Where she once signed off with hearts or playful jokes, now she used only an initial and business-like efficiency. Dr. Richard Stevens, an old college friend and the family physician, had mentioned during their last golf game that Victoria seemed different at Jake's recent checkup. When pressed, Richard became evasive, changing the subject with a professional deflection that suggested real concern. Alexander's driver, Miguel McConnell, pulled up in the black Mercedes. Miguel had been with the family for 5 years, a former Marine who served 2 tours in Afghanistan before transitioning to civilian security. His loyalty was absolute, his discretion complete, and his observations rarely wrong. "How was Chicago, Mr. Beck?" Miguel asked as they pulled into traffic. "Successful? Any unusual activity at the house while I was gone?" Miguel's eyes met Alexander's in the rearview mirror. Mrs. Beck had visitors. Same pattern as last month, late evenings cars, with tinted windows, meetings in the home office that lasted past midnight. Alexander had noticed the pattern too. Victoria's consulting business had always involved irregular hours, but recently, her clients preferred conducting business at their home instead of her downtown office. When Alexander had asked, Victoria explained that her new contracts involved sensitive corporate restructuring that required extra privacy. "The boy?" Alexander asked quietly. "Lately, he spends most of his time in his room when he's home from school. Seems to avoid Mrs. Beck when possible." Jake Beck was 11 years old. Bright and curious despite his recent withdrawal. Alexander had attributed his son's introversion to typical preteen issues, but Miguel's observation suggested something more troubling. Children didn't avoid their mothers without a reason. The Beck residence sat on 2 acres in Richmond's most exclusive neighborhood, a colonial mansion that Victoria had insisted they purchase despite Alexander's preference for something more modest. The house was beautiful but cold, with too many rooms and too few warm memories. As they pulled through the electronic gates, Alexander noticed that Victoria's BMW was in the garage, contradicting her text about working late. "Wait here," Alexander told Miguel. "I'll call if I need anything." The house felt eerily quiet as Alexander entered through the front door. Victoria's voice drifted from the living room, speaking in the low, controlled tones she used for business calls. Alexander moved silently through the foyer. His intelligence training made his movements quiet and disciplined. "Told you the timeline. Is firm. No extensions, no excuses. The client pays for results, not explanations." Victoria's voice had an edge Alexander rarely heard. "If you can't deliver, I'll find someone who can." Alexander paused at the doorway, studying his wife through the gap. Victoria sat in her favorite armchair, her auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun, her posture rigid with authority. At 38, she was still strikingly beautiful, but there was something predatory in her expression that Alexander didn't recognize. "Handle it, Grant. That's what I pay you for." She ended the call and looked up, startled slightly when she saw Alexander. "You're back early." Her smile was practiced and professional. "How did the merger go?" "Successfully closed." "Who was that on the phone?" "Grant Warren, my new business partner. We're handling some complex restructuring cases that require specialized approaches." Grant Warren. Alexander made a mental note to research the name. Victoria had never mentioned a business partner before, and her hesitation over specialized approaches suggested activities that wouldn't bear scrutiny. "Where's Jake?" "Upstairs doing homework. He's been having some behavioral issues lately. Nothing serious, just testing boundaries." Alexander nodded, but something in Victoria's tone raised red flags. Behavioral issues weren't typical for Jake, who'd always been a well-adjusted child, despite his parents' demanding careers. "I should check on him." "He's fine, Alexander. You worry too much." But Alexander was already climbing the stairs, his instincts telling him something was wrong. Jake's bedroom door was closed, which was unusual. The boy typically left it open, unless he was sleeping. Alexander knocked softly. "Jake, it's Dad. Come in." Alexander opened the door to find his son sitting at his desk, homework spread before him, but his attention was focused on something outside the window. Jake looked, up with eyes that held too much caution for an 11-year-old. "Hey, buddy, how was school?" "Fine." Jake's response was automatic, rehearsed. Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, studying his son's body language. The boy was tense, watchful, as if expecting trouble. "Everything okay at home while I was gone?" Jake's eyes flicked toward the door, then back to his father. "Mom's been different lately. She has meetings downstairs, and she says I'm not allowed to leave my room when they're happening." "What kind of meetings?" "I don't know, but sometimes there are kids there, kids I don't recognize, and they look—" Jake struggled for words. "They look scared, Dad." Alexander felt ice form in his veins. "Scared how?" "Like when Tommy Martinez got lost in the woods last year, remember? He had that look like he didn't know what was going to happen to him." Alexander remembered Tommy had been missing for 6 hours before search teams found him, and the experience had left the boy traumatized for weeks. The comparison was deeply troubling. "Jake, has your mother ever hurt you or made you do things you didn't want to do?" Jake's silence was answer enough. Alexander felt rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice gentle. "You can tell me anything, son. I promise you're safe." "She says consequences are a part of her business," Jake whispered. "She says I need to learn about consequences if I want to be part of this family." The words hit Alexander like physical blows. Whatever Victoria was involved in, it was affecting their son directly, and the mention of other children suggested something far worse than business consulting. "Jake, I want you to pack a bag. Just essentials, clothes for a few days, your tablet, whatever you need." "Are we going somewhere?" "Maybe. I need to understand what's been happening here while I was away." As Alexander helped his son pack, he was already planning his next moves. His intelligence background had taught him to gather information systematically and understand all variables before acting. But his parental instincts were screaming that Jake was in immediate danger. Victoria Tate Beck had built a facade of respectability around something dark and twisted. Grant Warren was part of it, and somehow children were involved. Children who looked scared, according to Jake. Alexander had spent 15 years in corporate warfare, but this felt like the beginning of something far more personal and infinitely more dangerous. His wife wasn't just hiding business activities, she was hiding crimes, and she had made the fatal mistake of involving their son. In intelligence work, the most dangerous enemies were those who looked like allies. Alexander was beginning to understand that he'd been living with the enemy for 12 years, and she'd been using their home as a base of operations. That was about to change. The discovery. Alexander waited until Victoria's BMW left the driveway the next morning before beginning his investigation. Jake was at school, Miguel was running errands, and Alexander had the house to himself for the first time in months. He started with Victoria's home office, a converted bedroom on the second floor that she kept locked. The lock was expensive, but not military grade. Alexander had it open in under 2 minutes, using techniques learned in intelligence training. Victoria's office was meticulously organized, files arranged alphabetically, a computer password protected, a safe built into the wall behind her desk. The computer proved more challenging. Victoria had implemented sophisticated security measures that suggested she was protecting more than client confidentiality. Alexander bypassed the login screen using a USB drive loaded with extraction software, a gift from former colleagues who transitioned to private sector work. What he found made his blood run cold. Financial records showed payments from offshore accounts totaling over $2 million in the past 18 months. The money came from shell companies, in countries known for lax banking oversight. Most disturbing were the payment descriptions: procurement services, transportation coordination, inventory management. The terminology suggested human trafficking. Alexander photographed everything, uploading the files to an encrypted cloud account. Victoria's email history revealed communications with Grant Warren that confirmed his worst fears. Children were being bought, sold, and transported through a network that Victoria helped coordinate. The behavioral issues I mentioned about Jake weren't discipline problems. They were preparation for something unspeakable. A folder labeled Local Inventory contained photographs that made Alexander's vision blur with rage. Dozens of children, ages 8 to 14, were photographed in sterile environments with identification numbers. Jake wasn't among them, but Alexander recognized several faces from missing persons reports he'd seen on the news. The safe behind Victoria's desk contained passports, cash, and a handgun. But more importantly, it held contracts and shipping manifests that revealed the scope of the operation. Victoria wasn't just a participant. She was a regional coordinator for what appeared to be an international trafficking network. Alexander was photographing the shipping manifests when he heard a car in the driveway. Through the window, he saw Victoria's BMW returning unexpectedly. He had 30 seconds to secure the office and get downstairs before she entered the house. He closed the safe, relocked the office door, and was in the kitchen making coffee when Victoria walked through the front door. "Forgot some files," she called. Out, her footsteps heading directly upstairs. Alexander waited, listening for signs that she detected his intrusion. The office door opened and closed. Drawers slid open. A minute later, Victoria came downstairs carrying a briefcase. "Busy day?" Alexander asked, keeping his voice casual. "Client emergency. I might be late tonight." She paused at the door, studying his face. "You look tired. Everything okay?" "Just jet lag. I'll probably turn in early." After Victoria left, Alexander called Miguel and arranged for Jake to stay with Alexander's sister in Baltimore for the weekend. He told Jake it was a surprise visit, but the boy seemed relieved to be leaving the house. That evening, Alexander contacted Dr. Richard Stevens. "Richard, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to ask no questions." "That sounds ominous." "Come to my house tomorrow around 7 p.m. Victoria will be out, but I want you to examine Jake when he gets back from Baltimore. Look for signs of abuse, physical, psychological, anything that suggests he's been harmed." "Alexander, what's going on?" "I can't explain yet, but I think Jake is in danger, and I need medical documentation of his condition before I take action." "What kind of action?" "The kind that ends threats permanently." Richard was quiet for a moment. "I'll be there." The next day, Alexander used his business connections to research Grant Warren's background. What he found was a pattern of association with organized crime figures, missing persons cases, and unexplained wealth. Warren had been arrested twice for human trafficking but never convicted. His charges were mysteriously dropped due to insufficient evidence and procedural errors. More disturbing was Warren's connection to a network of wealthy clients who paid premium prices for specialized services involving children. The network operated internationally, using legitimate businesses as fronts for trafficking operations. Victoria's consulting firm was one of those fronts. Alexander was studying the financial records when Miguel called with an update. Mrs. Beck just left the house with several suitcases. She told me she'd be away on business for the next few days." Did she say where? Chicago. But sir, I followed her to the airport. She didn't board a commercial flight. Private? Jet. No flight plan filed. Victoria was running, which meant she'd either detected Alexander's investigation or received a warning from someone in her network. Either way, Alexander's window for gathering evidence was closing. He called Richard Stevens and asked him to come immediately rather than waiting for the evening. Bring your medical bag and be prepared to document everything you see. This might be the only chance we get. Richard arrived 30 minutes later, his expression grim. Alexander, I need to tell you something before we continue. I've been concerned about Jake for months. During his last checkup, I noticed signs of psychological trauma, hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, anxiety responses to certain questions. What kind of questions? Questions about his home life, about his relationship with his mother. When I asked if he felt safe at home, he shut down completely. Alexander felt the last pieces of restraint crumble. What else? Physical signs? That suggested stress-induced illness, stomach problems, headaches, changes in appetite, classic symptoms of a child living in fear. But you didn't report it? I had no proof of abuse, and Victoria convinced me it was related to school stress and your travel schedule. I should have trusted my instincts. Alexander led Richard upstairs to Jake's room, pointing out details he'd noticed during his investigation. A recently installed lock on the inside of Jake's door, blackout curtains that blocked the outside view, and a small camera hidden in the ceiling light fixture. She was monitoring him, Alexander said, keeping him isolated and under surveillance. Richard examined the camera with growing horror. This isn't parental concern. This is containment. They were discussing the implications when Alexander's phone rang. Jake's school was calling. Mr. Beck, this is Principal Chapman. I'm afraid there's been an incident involving Jake. What kind of incident? He collapsed during lunch. He's conscious now, but he seems disoriented and frightened. We've called an ambulance. Alexander felt the world shift around him. We'll meet you at the hospital. As they drove to the hospital, Richard made an observation that would prove prophetic. Alexander, if Victoria is involved in trafficking, and if she was preparing Jake for that network, his collapse might not be medical. It might be a response to whatever they've been doing to condition him. What do you mean? Psychological breaking, physical conditioning, drug administration. Children in trafficking situations are often subjected to systematic abuse designed to make them compliant. Alexander's vision went red. How long would that process take? Months, maybe longer, depending on the child's resistance. Which meant Victoria had been systematically abusing their son while Alexander was traveling for business, believing his family was safe at home. The hospital came into view, and Alexander made a silent promise. By the time this was over, Victoria Tate Beck and Grant Warren would wish they'd never heard the name Jake Beck. But first, he needed to make sure his son survived whatever they'd done to him. The unveiling. Alexander burst through the emergency room doors with Dr. Stevens close behind, his heart hammering against his ribs. A nurse directed them to room 7, where Jake lay on a hospital bed looking small and fragile against the white sheets. His face was pale, and his eyes held a glassy quality that Alexander recognized from his intelligence days. The look of someone who'd been chemically sedated. Dad? Jake's voice was weak, confused. I'm here, buddy. You're safe now. Dr. Emily Woodward, the attending physician, approached with a clipboard and a concerned expression. Mr. Beck, I'm Dr. Woodward. Jake is stable, but I need to discuss his condition with you privately. Alexander squeezed his son's hand. Dr. Stevens will stay with Jake. He's our family physician. In a hallway, Dr. Woodward's expression was grave. Mr. Beck, Jake's blood work shows traces of several substances that are extremely concerning. Benzodiazepines, mild hallucinogens, and what appears to be a custom pharmaceutical cocktail designed to induce compliance and suppress resistance. Are you saying he was drugged? I'm saying he was systematically poisoned over an extended period. The levels suggest regular administration, probably disguised in food or drinks. These substances are commonly used in... She paused, choosing her words carefully. In situations where someone wants to control another person's behavior and mental state. Alexander felt rage building in his chest like a nuclear reaction. How long? Based on the blood chemistry, I'd estimate several months of regular exposure. Mr. Beck, I'm required by law to report this to Child Protective Services and law enforcement. Do it. I want everything documented. When they returned to Jake's room, Dr. Stevens was conducting his own examination while Jake dozed fitfully. Stevens's face was tight with controlled fury. Alexander, we need to talk now. They stepped into the hallway where Stevens spoke in low, urgent tones. The drug cocktail isn't random. It's a specific combination used by trafficking networks to condition children for transport and for client use. Jake shows signs of systematic psychological conditioning, responses to verbal cues, physical reactions to certain stimuli. Someone has been preparing your son for something unspeakable. Alexander's world tilted. How do you know about trafficking methods? I volunteer with an organization that helps trafficking survivors. I've seen these patterns before. Stevens grabbed Alexander's arm, his voice trembling. Sir, you need to call the cops before your wife, before she completes whatever process she started. The words hit Alexander like physical blows. His wife, the woman he'd shared a bed with for 12 years, had been systematically abusing their son in preparation for selling him to predators. There's more, Stevens continued. Jake mentioned something while you were talking to Dr. Woodward. He said his mother told him they were going on a special trip this weekend, a trip where he'd meet important people who would decide his future. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Change of plans. Pick up Jake from school early. We're taking a family trip. Don't disappoint me. The message carried an implicit threat. Victoria knew he was investigating her, and she was moving to secure her asset, their son, before Alexander could interfere. She's coming for him, Alexander said. Not if I can help it. Stevens was already moving toward the nurse's station. I'm placing Jake under a medical hold. He's too unstable to be discharged. That won't stop her if she's determined. Then, we make sure she can't find him. Alexander called Miguel while Stevens spoke to hospital security. Within minutes, Alexander had arranged for Jake to be transferred to a private facility where Victoria couldn't access him. But as they prepared for the transfer, Alexander's phone rang. Alexander Beck. The voice was male, unfamiliar, with a slight accent. Who is this? A friend of your wife's. She asked me to deliver a message. What message? She has something you want. You have something she needs. Perhaps we can arrange an exchange. Alexander felt ice form in his veins. What kind of exchange? Your son is safe for now, but that could change quickly. Victoria is prepared to be reasonable if you're prepared to be cooperative. Victoria doesn't have my son. He's right here, with me. A pause. Check your messages, Mr. Beck. Alexander's phone chimed with an incoming text containing a photograph. The image showed Jake's bedroom at home, but it wasn't empty. A child was lying on the bed. A child who looked exactly like Jake from a distance, but wasn't him upon closer inspection. Body double, the voice continued. Purchased from our specialty catalog. Your wife wanted to ensure a smooth transition when she collected the real asset. Alexander's mind raced. Victoria had been planning Jake's abduction for months, possibly years. The behavioral issues she'd mentioned weren't problems. They were tests to see how far she could push before Alexander became suspicious. What do you want? Very simple. You forget everything you've learned about your wife's business activities. You sign custody papers granting her sole parental rights. You transfer half your assets to accounts she'll specify. In exchange, your son continues to live. Just not with you. And if I refuse? Then the asset becomes inventory, and you become a liability. Neither outcome would be pleasant for your family. Alexander looked through the window at Jake, still unconscious on the hospital bed, and felt something fundamental shift inside him. His wife hadn't just betrayed their marriage. She'd been grooming their son for sexual slavery, while Alexander built a fortune to support the family he thought he was protecting. I need time to consider your offer. You have until tomorrow night. Victoria will call with final instructions. Alexander ended the call and turned to Stevens, who'd been listening with growing horror. They're going to kill you both regardless, Stevens said. You realize that, right? You've seen too much, and Jake can identify them. I know. So what are you going to do? Alexander looked at his unconscious son, thinking about the years of business trips while Victoria had unlimited access to systematically abuse Jake. Thinking about the children in those photographs, the offshore accounts, the network of predators who paid premium prices for innocence. I'm going to remind them why Army intelligence officers are trained to win wars, not just battles. Alexander. Dr. Stevens, how many trafficking survivors have you worked with? Dozens. How many of their abusers faced real consequences? Stevens was quiet. Very few. The networks are too sophisticated, too well connected. Most survivors never see justice. That's about to change. Alexander pulled out his phone and began making calls. The first was to his former commanding officer, Colonel Rodney Cooper, now retired and running a private security firm. Rodney, it's Alexander Beck. I need a favor and I need it off the books. What kind of favor? The kind that involves ending threats to children permanently. Within an hour, Alexander had assembled a team of former intelligence operatives and special forces personnel who specialized in what the government couldn't officially handle. Victoria Tate Beck and Grant Warren had built their network using money, fear, and the assumption that their victims would be too powerless to fight back. They were about to learn the difference between being powerful and being dangerous. And Alexander Beck had never been more dangerous in his life. The network exposed. Alexander established his command center in a secure location 40 miles outside Richmond, a decommissioned military facility that Colonel Cooper's security firm used for training exercises. The building's soundproof rooms and sophisticated surveillance equipment made it perfect for the kind of operation Alexander was planning. His team consisted of 5 specialists. Colonel Cooper himself, an expert in psychological warfare, Phil Bailey, a former NSA analyst who could penetrate any digital security system, Mitch Simon, a demolitions expert with a talent for making problems disappear, Peter Chapman, a master of surveillance and infiltration, and Lauren Root, whose expertise in interrogation techniques had made him legendary in intelligence circles. What we're dealing with, Alexander explained to his team, is a trafficking network that's been operating for at least 3 years. My wife, Victoria, coordinates regional operations. Her partner, Grant Warren, handles enforcement and client relations. They have connections to organized crime, political protection, and international networks. Phil Bailey looked up from his laptop, where he'd been analyzing the evidence Alexander had gathered. The financial structure is sophisticated. They're moving money through 17 different shell companies across 9 countries. A conservative estimate puts their operation at $50 million annually. How many children? Cooper asked. Based on the documentation I found, approximately 200 active cases across the Mid-Atlantic region. Ages 8 to 16, both domestic and international acquisitions. The room fell silent. Even seasoned operators had limits to what they could process emotionally. What's the primary objective? Chapman asked. Complete destruction of the network. No survivors, no loose ends, no possibility of reorganization. And secondary objectives? Recovery of the children, evidence preservation for law enforcement, and elimination of political protection. Lauren Root studied the photographs Alexander had taken from Victoria's safe. The political connections are extensive. 3 congressmen, a federal judge, 2 state senators, and multiple law enforcement officials. Taking down the network means taking down people with the power to retaliate. Then we make sure they can't retaliate. Alexander's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from an unknown number. Package delivered. Inspection at midnight, location to follow. The message was accompanied by an address in rural Virginia and instructions for arriving undetected. Victoria was setting up the promised exchange. Jake's life for Alexander's silence and money. It's a trap, Cooper said after reading the message. Of course it is. But it's also an opportunity to get inside their operation. Alexander, they're not planning to honor any agreement. The moment you show up, you're dead. Maybe, but they don't know what I've learned or who I've contacted. They think they're dealing with a desperate father who'll do anything to save his son. Aren't you? Alexander was quiet for a moment. I'm a desperate father, but I'm also someone who spent 8 years learning how to destroy enemies who hide behind walls, money, and political connections. Victoria made a critical error in judgment. She assumed I'd react emotionally instead of tactically. Phil Bailey looked up from his computer. I've been monitoring Victoria's communications. She's in contact with a client who's scheduled to inspect the merchandise tonight. The financial transfer for Jake is set at $2 million. Alexander felt rage build in his chest, but his voice remained calm. Then we give them what they're expecting. What do you mean? We let Victoria think she's won. We allow the meeting to proceed, but instead of exchanging Jake for money and silence, we use the gathering to identify everyone in their network. Chapman nodded slowly. Surveillance operation. More than surveillance. Elimination. Alexander outlined his plan. Instead of going to the meeting himself, he would send Mitch Simon disguised as Alexander, wearing body armor and equipped with recording equipment. Meanwhile, Chapman would infiltrate the location hours earlier to establish overwatch positions. Phil Bailey would monitor all electronic communications, and Lauren Root would position himself to interrogate any survivors. What about the children, who are already in the system? Cooper asked. Simultaneous raids on all known locations. We hit everything at once. Transportation hubs, safe houses, client locations, financial centers. By dawn tomorrow, there won't be enough left of their network to threaten anyone. The team spent the afternoon coordinating with law enforcement. Contacts who could be trusted. FBI agents Cooper had worked with, local detectives who specialized in child crimes, and federal prosecutors who'd been frustrated by political interference in trafficking cases. At 6 p.m., Alexander received another message from Victoria. Cabin on Route 301, mile marker 47. Come alone. Bring signed custody documents and bank transfer confirmations. Jake will be returned unharmed if you comply fully. The location was perfect for what Alexander had planned, isolated with multiple approach routes and escape paths. Chapman departed immediately to establish surveillance positions, while Phil Bailey began monitoring all cell phone traffic in the area. At 8 p.m., Alexander's phone rang. Victoria's voice was cold, businesslike. Alexander, I trust you've prepared everything we discussed. The papers are signed. The money is ready to transfer. Good. I want you to understand something before tonight's meeting. What you've discovered about my business activities, that stays between us. If you ever consider exposing what you've learned, remember that I know people who specialize in making problems disappear. I understand. Do you? Because I'm not just talking about you, Alexander. I'm talking about anyone you might have confided in. Your sister in Baltimore, for example, Dr. Stevens, even Colonel Cooper. Alexander felt ice form in his veins. Victoria knew about his team, which meant she'd been monitoring his communications or had sources inside law enforcement. How long have you known? Known what? That my husband was a former intelligence officer? I've known since before we were married, Alexander. Did you really think someone like me would choose a partner randomly? The implication hit him like a physical blow. You targeted me. I recruited you. Your background, your resources, your legitimate business activities, all perfect cover for my operations. For 12 years, you've been providing exactly what I needed. Respectability, financial networks, and geographic mobility. And Jake, insurance, a way to ensure your continued cooperation if you ever became problematic. Alexander realized that his marriage, his family, his entire adult life had been an elaborate deception designed to serve Victoria's criminal enterprise. She hadn't just betrayed him, she'd never been anything other than his enemy. See you at midnight, darling. The line went dead, and Alexander sat in silence for several minutes, processing the full scope of Victoria's manipulation. Then, he activated his team's communication system. Change of plans. This isn't just about destroying a trafficking network. It's about eliminating a counterintelligence operation that's been running for over a decade. What do you mean? Cooper asked. Victoria didn't just happen to become involved in trafficking. She's been using it as cover for something larger. Recruitment, blackmail, political control. We're not just taking down criminals. We're taking down a spy network that's been operating in plain sight. The mission parameters had shifted, but Alexander's resolve remained absolute. Victoria Tate Beck had used their son, their marriage, and their shared life as weapons against innocent children. Tonight, she would learn that some weapons were designed to cut both ways. The hunter's moon. At 11:03 p.m., Alexander's team was In position around the cabin on Route 301, Chapman had established overwatch from a tree line 300 yards east, with clear sight lines to all approaches. Phil Bailey monitored electronic communications from a van parked 2 miles away, tracking every cell phone and radio transmission within a 5-mile radius. Lauren Root had positioned himself near the access road, ready to intercept anyone attempting to escape. Mitch Simon, wearing body armor beneath clothes identical to Alexander's, approached the cabin according to the specified timeline. Hidden cameras and recording equipment would capture everything that happened inside. While Cooper coordinated the operation from the command vehicle, Alexander remained at the secure facility with Jake, who was recovering well from the drug treatments but still needed medical supervision. Dr. Stevens had agreed to stay with the boy while Alexander finished what Victoria had started. At 11:47 p.m., Chapman's voice crackled through the communication system. 3 vehicles approaching from the north, 4 occupants total. Looks like Victoria, Grant Warren, and 2 unknown males. Alexander watched through the hidden cameras as Victoria entered the cabin, followed by Warren and 2 men who carried themselves like professional security. Victoria looked confident, predatory, wearing the expression of someone who believed she held all the advantages. "Where's Beck?" Warren asked, scanning the shadows outside. "He'll be here." Alexander's nothing if not punctual. At exactly midnight, Mitch Simon emerged from the tree line, walking toward the cabin with the measured pace of someone trying to control their fear. Through the hidden cameras, Alexander watched Victoria's face light up with satisfaction. "Alexander, come in. We have much to discuss." Mitch entered the cabin, and Alexander's recording equipment captured everything that followed. "Where is my son?" Mitch asked, using Alexander's voice patterns. "Safe for now." Victoria gestured to a laptop on the cabin's table. "Real time. Video feed from our holding facility. As you can see, Jake is comfortable and well cared for." The screen showed a child lying on a bed in what appeared to be a medical facility. The child looked like Jake from a distance, but Alexander could tell it was the body double Victoria had mentioned. "The custody papers?" Victoria extended her hand. Mitch handed over documents that Phil Bailey had prepared. Legally worthless. Forgeries that would satisfy Victoria's immediate needs while providing no actual authority. "And the financial transfer? Ready to execute on your confirmation that Jake is released safely." Victoria studied the papers, then looked up with cold satisfaction. "You've been surprisingly cooperative, Alexander. I expected more resistance. I want my son safe. Nothing else matters." "Nothing else should matter. But I know you, Alexander. I know how your mind works. You've spent the last week investigating my business activities, gathering information, probably planning some dramatic confrontation." Mitch remained silent, letting Victoria reveal her hand. "The problem is that you don't understand the scope of what you're dealing with. My organization isn't just regional, it's international. The clients aren't just wealthy perverts. They're political leaders, business executives, people with the power to destroy anyone who threatens their interests." Warren stepped forward, producing a tablet that displayed financial records and photographs. "Your investigation led you to discover maybe 10% of our operation. The rest goes deeper than you can imagine." Alexander watched through the cameras as Warren revealed the true scope of their network. It wasn't just trafficking. It was a comprehensive blackmail operation targeting political leaders, business executives, and law enforcement officials. The children weren't just victims. They were weapons used to control powerful people through recorded compromises. 17 senators, 43 congressmen, 6 governors, 2 Supreme Court justices, and over 200 corporate executives, Victoria continued. All of them compromised, all of them under our control. That's real power, Alexander, not the corporate merger games you've been playing. What do you want from me? Complete integration into our operation. Your business networks, your financial expertise, your military contacts. In exchange, Jake lives, and you become part of the most powerful shadow organization in the country. And if I refuse? Warren smiled coldly. Then you discover what happened to the other husbands who became problematic. Through the cameras, Alexander watched Victoria produce a file containing photographs of 4 men, all apparently dead from various causes. Car accidents, suicides, medical emergencies. Recruitment sometimes requires permanent solutions to family complications. Alexander felt rage building, but he forced himself to remain analytical. Victoria and Warren were revealing everything, apparently confident that Mitch Alexander had no choice but to accept their terms. "I need guarantees," Mitch said. "Protection for my son, legal immunity, financial security." "You'll have all of that and more. But first, you need to prove your commitment to our organization." Victoria produced another laptop, this one displaying a live video from what appeared to be a warehouse. Alexander's blood turned to ice as he recognized the location. It was one of the addresses from Victoria's shipping manifests, and it contained dozens of children in various stages of processing. "Tomorrow night, we have a special event for our most exclusive clients. You're going to coordinate security for the gathering." "What kind of gathering?" "The kind that generates enough compromising material to control a federal judge for the rest of his career." Alexander had heard enough. Through his communication system, he activated the final phase of his operation. "All teams, execute." Chapman's voice came through immediately. "Multiple targets acquired, beginning elimination sequence." Phil Bailey reported, "Electronic communications jammed, no signals getting in or out." Lauren Root confirmed, "Access road secured, no one leaves alive." Alexander's team moved with precision born from years of combat experience. Warren and his security personnel were eliminated before they could draw weapons. Victoria found herself surrounded by operatives who materialized from the shadows like death itself. Through the cameras, Alexander watched Victoria's confidence crumble as she realized the scope of her miscalculation. "You're not Alexander Beck," she said to Mitch. "No." Alexander's voice came through hidden speakers. "But I am." Alexander entered the cabin wearing full tactical gear, followed by Cooper and 3 additional operators. Victoria backed against the wall, her composure finally cracking. "This is impossible. My contacts, my protection." "Your contacts are under federal arrest as we speak. Your protection just learned what happens when you shield child traffickers from military intelligence operatives." Phil Bailey's voice crackled through the communication system. "Primary target location secure. 47 children recovered alive. Network infrastructure completely destroyed." Alexander looked at his wife, the woman who had manipulated him for 12 years, who had systematically abused their son, who had built an empire on the suffering of children. "Victoria Tate Beck, you're under arrest for human trafficking, child abuse, conspiracy, and treason." "Treason?" "The blackmail operation targeting federal officials constitutes espionage against the United States government. That carries special penalties." As federal agents entered the cabin to process the crime scene, Alexander felt a grim satisfaction. Victoria's network was destroyed, the children were safe, and the political officials who had enabled the operation were facing their own reckonings. But the night wasn't over yet. Alexander had one final message to deliver to anyone who might consider rebuilding what Victoria had created. Some lessons needed to be taught with permanent clarity. Aftermath and reckoning. Dawn broke over the Richmond skyline as Alexander sat in the FBI field office, watching through one-way glass as Victoria underwent her initial interrogation. She had maintained her composure through the arrest and processing, but Alexander could see cracks in her facade as the full scope of the federal charges became clear. Special Agent Roy Keller, who was leading the trafficking investigation, emerged from the interrogation room with a thick file of documents. "She's not talking," Keller said. "Demanded a lawyer and invoked her right to silence." "What about Warren's associates?" "Singing like canaries. Apparently their loyalty only extended as far as their paychecks." Keller sat down across from Alexander, his expression grim. "Mr. Beck, what we've uncovered in the past 8 hours goes beyond anything we've seen before. The blackmail network your wife was running compromised officials at every level of government. Alexander had spent the night coordinating with federal agencies as they systematically dismantled Victoria's operation. Raids on 17 locations had recovered 93 children and arrested 47 adults involved in trafficking, transportation, and client services. The political fallout was only beginning. How many officials are implicated? Initial counts suggest over 200 federal, state, and local figures. We're talking about senators, judges, police chiefs, prosecutors, people who should have been protecting children instead of exploiting them." Alexander thought about Jake, who was still recovering at the secure medical facility. Dr. Stevens had reported that the boy was making progress, but the psychological damage from months of systematic abuse would require extensive therapy. What about my son's case specifically? Victoria and Warren face federal charges for child abuse, trafficking conspiracy, and attempted sale of a minor. The evidence you gathered provides clear documentation of their intent to sell Jake to their client network. Keller paused, studying Alexander's expression. There's something else. During our raids, we discovered documentation suggesting Victoria had been planning this for years, possibly since before Jake was born. What do you mean? Medical records showing she had been administering mild sedatives to Jake since he was 6 years old. Psychological conditioning programs designed to make him compliant. Educational modifications to isolate him from potential support networks. Keller's voice hardened. Your wife wasn't just abusing your son. She was systematically preparing him for sexual slavery from early childhood. Alexander felt rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. How is that possible? I would have noticed. She was careful. The drugs were administered in doses small enough to seem like normal childhood illnesses. The psychological conditioning was disguised as discipline and educational structure. You were traveling frequently for business, and she had complete control over Jake's daily routine. The implications were staggering. Alexander had spent years building a fortune to support his family, while Victoria used his absence to systematically destroy their son's psychological defenses. Mr. Beck, I need to ask you something directly. Keller leaned forward. The operation you conducted last night, it was extremely sophisticated, almost like it was planned by someone with extensive intelligence training. I had help from some former colleagues. I assumed as much. But I want you to understand that while we appreciate the results, the methods you used crossed several legal boundaries. Alexander met Keller's gaze directly. Are you planning to prosecute me for stopping child traffickers? I'm planning to ensure that justice is served through proper legal channels from this point forward. What about the political officials who are being blackmailed? Are they facing charges? Keller's expression darkened. That's where things get complicated. Some of them were unwilling victims, people who were compromised through coercion or deception. Others appear to have been willing participants who used the network's services regularly. And you can tell the difference. Financial records, communication logs, frequency of contact. The willing participants paid premium prices for specific services and showed no signs of attempting to escape the blackmail situation. Alexander understood the distinction, but he also understood that political pressure would protect some officials while sacrificing others. How many of the willing participants will actually face prosecution? Keller was quiet for a moment. As many as the evidence will support and political reality will allow. It was an honest answer, but not a satisfying one. Alexander had learned in intelligence work that justice and law enforcement didn't always align perfectly. His phone buzzed with a call from Dr. Stevens. Alexander, Jake's awake and asking for you. His cognitive function is improving rapidly, now that the drugs are clearing his system. I'll be there in an hour. As Alexander prepared to leave the FBI office, Agent Keller handed him a business card. Mr. Beck, given your background and what you accomplished last night, the Bureau would be interested in discussing consulting opportunities. We handle a lot of cases involving organized crime and trafficking that could benefit from your particular expertise. I'll consider it. One more thing. Victoria's lawyer is already making noise about seeking custody of Jake pending her trial. Apparently she's claiming you kidnapped him and that she was attempting to protect him from your dangerous associates. Alexander felt cold fury settle in his chest. She's claiming I kidnapped my own son? It won't hold up in court, especially given the evidence we've gathered, but it suggests she's planning to fight the custody issue aggressively. Then she's going to learn that some battles are decided outside courtrooms. Alexander left the FBI office and drove to the medical facility where Jake was recovering. His son looked smaller than usual in the hospital bed, but his eyes were clearer than they'd been in months. Dad, are you okay? You look really tired. Alexander sat beside the bed, taking Jake's hand. I'm fine, buddy. How are you feeling? Better. Dr. Stevens says the medicine that was making me sick is almost gone from my body. What do you remember about the last few months? Jake was quiet for a moment. Mom was giving me special vitamins that made me sleepy. She said they would help me grow stronger, but they made me feel weird and confused. What else? She had friends over a lot. They would look at me like I was something they wanted to buy. It made me scared. But when I tried to tell you, the words wouldn't come out right. Alexander felt rage building again, but he kept his voice gentle. You're safe now, Jake. Mom can't hurt you anymore. What's going to happen to her? She's got to face consequences for the things she did to you and to other children. Jake nodded, processing this with a seriousness that no 11-year-old should possess. Dad, I'm glad you came home when you did. I think something really bad was about to happen to me. Alexander squeezed his son's hand, making a promise that would define the rest of their lives together. Nothing bad will ever happen to you again, Jake. I promise you that. But even as he made the promise, Alexander was planning his next moves. Victoria's trial would take months, maybe years. During that time, she would have access to lawyers, appeals, and potentially corrupt officials who might arrange for her early release or case dismissal. Alexander had spent 20 years learning that some enemies were too dangerous to leave alive, regardless of what legal systems might decide. Victoria Tate Beck had made a career of destroying children's lives. She had systematically abused his son while manipulating their marriage for criminal purposes. The legal system would provide due process. Alexander would provide justice. And there was a significant difference between the two. The trap unfolds. 3 weeks after Victoria's arrest, Alexander received an unexpected visitor at his home. Miguel had been screening all contacts since the FBI raids, but the woman who appeared at their gate carried credentials that demanded attention. Federal Judge Patricia Gates, one of the officials Alexander had seen on Victoria's blackmail list. Alexander met her in his study, noting how she kept her hands visible and her voice carefully modulated, the behavior of someone who knew she was being recorded. Mr. Beck, I need to discuss a matter of mutual concern. What kind of matter? Your wife's case. More specifically, certain complications that have arisen during the legal proceedings. Alexander waited, letting silence pressure her to reveal more than she intended. Victoria's attorney has presented evidence suggesting that her trafficking operation was actually an undercover investigation into political corruption. She claims to have been working with federal agencies to expose officials who were exploiting children. The lie was sophisticated, but Alexander had expected something like this. Victoria had spent years building relationships with corrupt officials. Using those relationships to create an escape route was predictable. What kind of evidence? Documentation that appears to show communication with FBI and CIA handlers. Financial records that could be interpreted as operational funding rather than criminal profits. Testimony from associates claiming they were undercover operatives. Alexander recognized the pattern from his intelligence days. When caught, operatives often claimed they were working for the other side. Sometimes it was even true. What do you want from me, Judge Gates? Victoria's attorney is claiming that you compromised a federal investigation through unauthorized vigilante action. They're seeking to have all evidence dismissed based on illegal interference with law enforcement operations. And you're here because... Judge Gates was quiet for a long moment. Because if Victoria's claims are true, then the federal investigation that exposed over 200 officials was itself compromised. Every case, every arrest, every conviction could be overturned on appeal. Alexander understood the implication. Whether Victoria was lying or telling the truth, her claims could destroy the entire legal proceeding against the trafficking network. What's your assessment of her claims? Personally, I think she's lying. But professionally, I have to consider the possibility that we're dealing with a counterintelligence operation that went bad, or a counterintelligence operation that was always designed to protect trafficking networks rather than expose them. Judge Gates nodded grimly. Which brings me to why I'm really here. Victoria's attorney has scheduled a hearing for tomorrow where they'll present this evidence publicly. If successful, Victoria walks free, and every official on her blackmail list claims they were victims of an unauthorized federal sting operation, including you, including me. Alexander studied Judge Gates's face, looking for signs of deception. She seemed genuinely concerned about Victoria's legal strategy. But Alexander had learned not to trust anyone who appeared on trafficking-related blackmail lists. Judge Gates, let me ask you directly. Were you a willing participant in Victoria's network, or were you being blackmailed? Her answer would determine whether she left his house alive. Blackmailed. Victoria's people photographed me in a compromising situation with someone who turned out to be underage. I've been making legal decisions based on their threats for over 2 years. What kind of decisions? Dismissed cases, reduced sentences, sealed records, anything they needed to protect their operation and their clients. Alexander made a mental note to verify her claims later, but her apparent honesty suggested she might be useful. What do you propose we do about tomorrow's hearing? That depends on whether you're prepared to testify about what you discovered during your investigation and risk having the entire case dismissed if Victoria's claims are accepted, or ensure that the truth comes out regardless of her legal maneuvering. Alexander considered the options. Victoria's escape strategy was sophisticated, but not perfect. If she was claiming to be an undercover operative, she would need to explain why she had been systematically abusing Jake and preparing him for sale. Judge Gates, there's something Victoria's attorney doesn't know about the evidence I gathered. What? I have recorded conversations where Victoria explicitly discusses selling Jake to specific clients, not as part of any investigation, but as a personal transaction designed to eliminate him as a complication in her criminal operations. Judge Gates's expression shifted from concern to something approaching relief. That would destroy her undercover operative defense. It would. But I've been holding that evidence in reserve. Why? Alexander was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. Because I wanted to see who would try to help her escape. Justice, corrupt officials supporting her claims, defense attorneys with suspicious funding sources, federal agents who might be compromised. You're saying this entire legal proceeding has been a trap? I'm saying that catching traffickers is only half the battle. The other half is identifying everyone who enables them. Judge Gates was silent for several minutes, processing the implications. Mr. Beck, if you testify tomorrow with that evidence, Victoria's defense collapses completely. But it also means exposing whatever operation you've been running to identify compromised officials. I'm prepared for that. Are you prepared for the consequences? Some of the people on Victoria's list have enough power to make your life very difficult, even from prison. But I know it's more than zero, which means the consequences of action are preferable to the consequences of inaction. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the federal courthouse wearing his best suit and carrying a briefcase containing evidence that would either ensure Victoria's conviction or trigger his own arrest for obstruction of justice. The hearing room was packed with reporters, federal agents, and observers from various political offices. Victoria sat at the defense table wearing an orange jumpsuit, but maintaining the composed expression of someone who believed she held a winning hand. When called to testify, Alexander approached the witness stand with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years preparing for this moment. Victoria's attorney, William Andrews, began his questioning with barely concealed aggression. Mr. Beck, isn't it true that you conducted an unauthorized investigation into federal law enforcement operations? No. Isn't it true that you used former military personnel to interfere with ongoing federal investigations? No. Then how do you explain the systematic destruction of evidence and elimination of witnesses that occurred during your vigilante operation? Alexander looked directly at Victoria, noting how her expression had shifted from confidence to concern. I can explain it very simply. I have recorded conversations where my wife explicitly discusses selling our 11-year-old son to sexual predators. For $2 million, would you like me to play those recordings for the court? The courtroom erupted in chaos as Andrews realized his client's defense had just collapsed completely. Victoria's claims about being an undercover operative couldn't explain why she was recorded planning to sell her own child. But Alexander wasn't finished. As the judge restored order, he produced additional evidence that would ensure Victoria never had another opportunity to hurt children. Your Honor, I also have documentation showing that Mrs. Beck has been systematically drugging our son for over 5 years, along with detailed plans for his psychological conditioning and eventual sale to specific clients. Victoria's face went white as she realized the scope of Alexander's evidence. Her attorney was frantically flipping through papers, looking for some way to salvage a defense that had just been obliterated. Alexander continued his testimony for 3 hours, methodically, destroying every aspect of Victoria's claims while presenting irrefutable evidence of her crimes. By the time he stepped down from the witness stand, Victoria's fate was sealed. But more importantly, Alexander had achieved his primary objective, identifying every official, attorney, and federal agent who had attempted to help Victoria escape justice. The trap had worked perfectly. Now came the consequences. Justice served. The verdicts came down exactly 6 months after Alexander's testimony. Victoria Tate Beck, life in prison without the possibility of parole on 47 counts of human trafficking, child abuse, and conspiracy. Grant Warren, death penalty for murder during trafficking operations. 17 political officials, sentences ranging from 10 years to life, depending on their level of participation. Alexander sat in the courthouse gallery as each verdict was read, feeling a grim satisfaction as the legal system finally delivered consequences for crimes that had destroyed hundreds of lives. Victoria showed no emotion as her sentence was announced, maintaining the cold composure that had defined their 12-year marriage. But Alexander's work wasn't finished. During the 6 months of legal proceedings, he had continued gathering intelligence on the broader network that had enabled Victoria's operations. What he discovered was a system of corruption that extended far beyond individual criminals to include institutional failures at every level. Federal agencies had ignored warnings about trafficking operations. Political officials had traded votes for protection. Law enforcement had deliberately misdirected investigations to shield wealthy clients. The legal system had provided justice for Victoria and her immediate associates, but the structures that had enabled them remained largely intact. Alexander had decided that those structures needed to be dismantled permanently. His opportunity came when Special Agent Keller contacted him about consulting on a new trafficking case in Baltimore. The investigation involved a network similar to Victoria's, but with different leadership and different political connections. "We could use your expertise in understanding how these operations function," Keller explained during their meeting. "Your insights into Victoria's network helped us develop new investigative protocols. What kind of consulting are you looking for?" "Undercover work. These networks only trust people with specific backgrounds and connections. Your business credentials and former military service make you an ideal candidate for infiltration operations." Alexander accepted the consulting contract, but not for the reasons Keller expected. Instead of simply gathering evidence for legal prosecution, Alexander planned to use his access to systematically destroy trafficking networks through methods that would ensure permanent results. Over the next 18 months, Alexander worked on 7 different cases across 4 states. In each situation, he gathered evidence for federal prosecutors while simultaneously implementing his own solutions for problems that the legal system couldn't address. Network leaders suffered fatal accidents. Political protectors found their careers destroyed by strategic leaks. Financial systems were disrupted through sophisticated cyber attacks. Client lists were published on dark websites frequented by vigilante groups. The results were dramatic. Trafficking operations in the Mid-Atlantic region declined by 70%. Political officials became reluctant to provide protection for criminal networks. Law enforcement agencies improved their response protocols to avoid federal oversight. Most importantly, children stopped disappearing into systems designed to exploit them. Alexander's methods were illegal, brutal, and completely effective. During this period, Jake made remarkable progress in therapy. Dr. Stevens reported that the boy's psychological recovery was proceeding better than expected, largely due to the knowledge that his abusers had faced permanent consequences. "He feels safe," Stevens explained during one of their consultations. "Not just physically safe, but psychologically safe. He knows that the people who hurt him can never hurt anyone again." Alexander had made sure of that. On the 2nd anniversary of Victoria's arrest, Alexander received a visit from Colonel Cooper, who had helped coordinate the original operation against Victoria's network. "Alexander, we need to talk about your consulting work." "What about it?" "Federal agencies are starting to notice patterns. Trafficking operations you investigate tend to suffer catastrophic failures that go beyond normal law enforcement outcomes. Criminals make enemies. Sometimes those enemies take action that the legal system can't. And sometimes former intelligence officers decide that permanent solutions are preferable to legal complications." Alexander met Cooper's gaze directly. "Are you concerned about my methods?" I'm concerned about your exposure. What you're doing is necessary, but it's also extremely dangerous. If federal agencies decide you're operating outside legal boundaries, they'll have no choice but to prosecute. What do you recommend? Retire from consulting. Focus on raising Jake. Let other people handle the next phase of this work. Alexander considered Cooper's advice, but he also thought about the hundreds of children who were safe because trafficking networks no longer operated with impunity. His work had created a climate of fear among predators who had previously felt untouchable. One more case, Alexander said. Then I'll step back. The final case involved a network operating in Washington, D.C. that specialized in providing children to political figures. The investigation had stalled due to political interference, and federal agents suspected that high-ranking officials were actively protecting the operation. Alexander accepted the assignment, knowing it would be his most dangerous but also, potentially, his most important. If successful, he could dismantle the political protection systems that enabled trafficking networks to operate with institutional support. The operation took 4 months to plan and execute. Alexander infiltrated the network by posing as a wealthy businessman seeking specialized services for political associates. His military background and legitimate business credentials provided perfect cover for accessing the highest levels of the organization. What he discovered was worse than anything he had seen in Victoria's network. The Washington operation didn't just traffic children, it used them as weapons in political warfare. Compromising photographs and recordings were used to control senators, judges, and cabinet officials. The network had effectively captured significant portions of the federal government through systematic blackmail. Alexander's solution was correspondingly comprehensive. On a single night in December, 17 network leaders died in apparent accidents. A massive cyber attack destroyed all electronic records and financial systems. Client lists were simultaneously released to major news organizations and law enforcement agencies. Political officials found themselves facing federal investigations they couldn't suppress or influence. Within 72 hours, the entire network had collapsed. The political fallout lasted for months. 23 federal officials resigned in disgrace. 37 faced criminal charges. Congress passed emergency legislation increasing penalties for trafficking crimes and eliminating political immunity for related offenses. Most importantly, the institutional protection systems that had enabled trafficking networks were permanently disrupted. Alexander's consulting career ended as quietly as it had begun. He returned to Richmond, to his legitimate business interests, and to the daily work of raising a son who was finally free from the shadows of his early trauma. But the message had been sent and received throughout the criminal underworld. Children were no longer unprotected victims. They had defenders who would use any means necessary to ensure their safety. And some of those defenders had learned their skills in places where mercy was a luxury that enemies couldn't afford. New beginnings. 5 years after Victoria's conviction, Alexander stood in the yard of their new home in Colorado, watching Jake practice baseball with a high school team. At 16, the boy had grown into a confident young man whose easy smile and natural athleticism gave no hint of the trauma he'd survived in childhood. The move to Colorado had been Jake's idea. After finishing therapy and establishing a strong support network in Richmond, he'd expressed interest in starting fresh somewhere with mountains and clean air. Alexander had been happy to relocate, using the sale of his consulting firm to purchase a ranch outside Denver where they could build the life they'd never had the chance to create. Dr. Stevens had maintained contact throughout Jake's recovery, providing guidance and support as the boy processed his experiences and developed healthy coping mechanisms. His final assessment had been remarkably positive. Jake showed no lasting psychological damage from his mother's abuse, largely because he understood that justice had been served and that his father would always protect him. "Dad, watch this," Jake called out, connecting solidly with a fastball and sending it sailing over the fence. "Great swing, son. Coach Peterson's going to love that power." Jake had been recruited by 3 Division I programs, but he'd already decided to attend the University of Colorado, where he could study criminology while staying close to home. His interest in law enforcement came naturally from his experiences, but Alexander had been careful to encourage, rather than pressure, his son's career choices. The ranch house was comfortable but not ostentatious, reflecting Alexander's preference for privacy over display. He'd kept his wealth quiet, using it primarily to ensure Jake's security and education while maintaining a lifestyle that wouldn't attract unwanted attention. Alexander's phone buzzed with a call from Agent Keller, who had remained in contact despite Alexander's retirement from consulting work. "Alexander, I want to give you an update on something you'll find interesting." "What's that?" "Victoria died in prison last week. Apparent suicide, though there are some questions about the circumstances." Alexander felt no emotion beyond mild satisfaction. "Questions?" "She was found hanging in her cell, but the autopsy showed evidence of a struggle. Other inmates reported hearing arguing earlier that evening. Any investigation?" "Officially, yes. Unofficially, Victoria had made enough enemies among trafficking survivors that prison justice seems like a reasonable explanation." Alexander had learned that some forms of justice operated outside courtrooms and legal proceedings. Victoria's death meant she could never escape, never appeal, never manipulate the system for early release. "How's the trafficking situation overall?" "Significantly improved. The networks you helped dismantle haven't reorganized, and new operations are much smaller and less sophisticated. Your work created a climate where trafficking is genuinely dangerous for the criminals involved." "Good. Alexander, there's something else. The FBI has been tracking some unusual activities in international trafficking networks, operations being systematically destroyed by unknown actors using military-grade tactics. Any thoughts on who might be responsible?" Alexander smiled grimly. "Sounds like someone learned that protecting children requires permanent solutions. The methods are remarkably similar to what happened with Victoria's network, almost like they were planned by someone with extensive intelligence training, or by someone who understands that some enemies are too dangerous to leave alive." Keller was quiet for a moment. "Well, whoever is responsible, they're getting results. Child trafficking in North America has declined by over 60% in the past 5 years. After the call ended, Alexander walked to his home office, where he maintained files on international trafficking networks that were still operating. His retirement from official consulting hadn't ended his interest in protecting children. It had simply made his methods more direct and less encumbered by legal constraints. The network he was currently studying operated out of Eastern Europe, trafficking children throughout the international market. The leaders were protected by corrupt government officials and sophisticated security measures that made traditional law enforcement ineffective. But Alexander had learned that no security measures were sufficient against someone with unlimited resources and a complete commitment to permanent solutions. His phone rang again, this time with a call from Jake. "Dad, I'm staying for extra practice tonight. Coach wants to work on my defensive positioning." "Sounds good. I'll pick you up at 8. Actually, Sarah's mom is driving her home anyway, so she can drop me off. That way you don't have to make the trip." Alexander smiled at his son's consideration. Jake had developed into a thoughtful young man who balanced independence with respect for family commitments. "Okay, but call when you're on your way home." "Will do. Love you, Dad." "Love you too, son." As evening approached, Alexander prepared for the kind of work that had become his true calling. The Eastern European network had operations in 12 countries, generated over $200 million annually, and destroyed thousands of children's lives every year. Within 6 months, it would cease to exist. Alexander had learned that some problems required business solutions, negotiation, compromise, legal frameworks. Other problems required military solutions, a precise application of overwhelming force against enemies who understood only strength. Child trafficking fell into the second category. The phone call came at exactly 9:15 p.m. as Alexander was finalizing his operational planning. "Mr. Beck, this is Colonel Nicholas Weeks, U.S. Special Operations Command. We need to meet." "About what?" "About a job offer that would allow you to continue your current activities with official sanction and unlimited resources." Alexander set down his files and walked to the window overlooking the ranch where he'd built a new life with his son. "What kind of job offer?" "The kind that involves protecting children on a global scale using methods that traditional law enforcement can't employ." Alexander thought about Jake, who was building his own future based on justice and protection rather than victimization and fear. He thought about Victoria, whose death had closed a chapter, but not the story. He thought about the thousands of children who were still trapped in networks that operated with impunity because no one was willing to use truly effective methods. When do we meet? Tomorrow. There's a situation in Thailand that requires immediate attention. Alexander looked at the files on his desk. Intelligence on trafficking networks that would continue destroying lives until someone with sufficient commitment decided to end them permanently. I'll be there. As he prepared for what would likely be his final transition from private citizen to active operator, Alexander felt the same certainty that had guided him through Victoria's destruction and everything that followed. Some enemies could be negotiated with, some could be reformed, some could be contained through legal measures, others simply needed to be eliminated. Alexander Beck had become very good at making those distinctions, and even better at implementing the solutions that each situation required. The war for children's safety would never truly end. But Alexander had learned that some battles could be won so decisively that the enemy never recovered. Tonight he would enjoy dinner with his son, secure in the knowledge that their life together had been built on a foundation of justice that no enemy could ever destroy. Some stories ended with forgiveness and reconciliation. This one ended with the understanding that evil required permanent consequences and that some fathers were willing to become whatever was necessary to protect the children who depended on them. 10 years later, Jake Beck would graduate from the FBI Academy and begin his own career protecting children from predators. He would never know the full extent of his father's international activities, but he would understand that some forms of justice operated outside courtrooms and legal systems. Alexander Beck's official record would show a successful businessman who consulted occasionally on federal trafficking cases. His unofficial record would be written in the destroyed networks and eliminated threats that made the world safer for innocent children. Victoria Tate Beck's network would never be rebuilt. The fear that Alexander had created among trafficking organizations would persist for decades, making criminal operations too dangerous and unprofitable to sustain. In a ranch house in Colorado, a father and son would continue building a life based on the understanding that family is defined not by blood, but by the willingness to sacrifice everything to protect the people who matter most. This was a story about consequences, the consequences of evil, the consequences of courage, and the consequences of refusing to accept that some enemies deserve mercy. Alexander Beck had learned to deliver all three types of consequences with equal precision, and the world was better for it. As this story fades into the quiet corners of your mind, remember that every tale is an invitation to look deeper, to listen harder, to embrace both the darkness and the light. If this narrative resonated with you, consider liking this video, subscribing to join our community, and hitting the bell icon so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for watching.